Здравствуйте, друзья! Today we're discussing The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And this is a continuation of my Reading the Classic series where I'm not really reviewing these classic books, but more having a broad, open discussion. I'm sharing my thoughts, my experience reading the work, character breakdown, analysis. We're talking about main themes, ideas, motifs, all of that, some historical context as well. And also, I like hearing your experience reading the works in the comments below. So, without further ado, let's talk about The Idiot. First off, a little bit about the work and the author itself. If you don't know, Fyodor Dostoevsky, massive figure in Russian literature, along with Tolstoy, coming out of the 19th century. And The Idiot happens to be one of his 4 major novels that he published in his lifetime, including, of course, The Idiot. Crime and Punishment was that first of the 4. And then you have Demons, also known as The Possessed, and The Brothers Karamazov, his last novel. And all of these originated after he had this near-death experience, which is outlined and discussed in Notes from a Dead Horse. And all these novels kind of originate out of some of the ideas and inklings that were in Notes from Underground. So, with all that said, for me, this was my last novel of the 4 to read. I started off with Demons, not the best to start off with, which I'll get to towards the end of the video. Then I came around to The Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, and finally read The Idiot. So I've almost worked my way around Dostoevsky's entire corpus. I've also read a number of his short stories as well, and the novella Notes from Underground. So I feel like I had, going into this book and reading The Idiot, I had a really good foundation to give myself the best chance of absorbing as much as I could out of the book, if that makes sense. Because Dostoevsky, as one of the literary greats, is masterful at weaving in different ideological positions, philosophical questions, and concepts into not only the plot and some of the monologues or dialogues within the story, but into the characters themselves, their traits, their behaviors, and all of that. So, going into this work, I felt confident, and I definitely had a better grasp on everything after an initial read. In regards to The Idiot, the story primarily follows the character named Prince Lev Nikolaevich Myshkin, often referred to as Prince Myshkin or just the Prince throughout the novel. And he is this young idealist. He's has faith in humanity. He loves passionately. He is a faithful man. He holds virtues in high regard, rather than the kind of moral decay and corrupt society that we'll get to later, and some of the characters that represent that, especially how it was occurring in Russia at the time. But the prince is this idealist, this passionate and optimistic young man. But he's also called an idiot often throughout the entire novel, and hence the title of the book. Now, he's called an idiot for a few reasons. One, because he does have this naive outlook on the world. At least that's how it's perceived in the novel. You believe that society and love and all these things can be this. They can attain this high virtuous outcome, but you see that reality is full of corruption and cynicism and all that. So there's this conflict going on that we'll get to in a moment. But he's perceived as an idiot for just being naive. And then he's also considered an idiot partially for his illness, which is just he has these sporadic seizures, basically. And of course, they happen at very inopportune times during the novel, but that's something to clue into as well. Now, the novel overall is tragic, not only in the ending, but just in different parts of it. It felt very tragic. Yet in other times, it was comforting, it was philosophical, it was enriching to the soul. It filled me with happiness at times during different scenes where, love is being poured out from a character. And my biggest takeaway is that it was enjoyable throughout the whole novel. So it didn't have too many highs where I was completely enthralled and enamored with a certain section and just reeling through the pages like I was in The Brothers Karamazov in part 3 and 4. But there weren't many lows either. So it was kind of like a steady stream of enjoyment, I would say, throughout the whole novel, which I kind of liked. I was especially expecting some kind of climactic event, which did eventually occur, later in the novel. But it's almost like I was on the edge of my seat from reading past Dostoevsky works. And this one was a little bit more of a slow drip of enjoyment throughout the whole work. The other thing is almost every character has this quality of a ticking time bomb. And what I mean is, at any moment, 5 or 6 of these characters are just making sporadic decisions. They're completely erratic. They are so indecisive, and you think at one point they're gonna, kill somebody, or they're going to make some drastic decision that's going to alter the whole story. You're constantly worried these characters are just going to jump off the cliff, so to speak, and yet, for the most part, they don't. But man, every character just has this quality, like I said, of a ticking time bomb. And the last thing I add before we get to the themes, main questions, and ideas is you have 2 love triangles going on within this novel. And you think, oh, that leads to a bunch of romance. And there is some romance and love and passion, certainly, throughout the novel. But most of it is just frustration. And you'll see why once we get a little bit later into this video. I talk about the specific characters and the love triangles themselves. But it throws you for a whirlwind when you're trying to handle all the different things going on, especially when we have the prince here at the center of all this chaos. Now, when it comes to the themes and questions within the novel, like any Dostoevsky novel, he is inquiring about morality, this ambiguity that has started to coat society about what is right, what is wrong, good and evil, does it even exist, does God even exist? All these questions lurk throughout the novel, especially through the character Ippolit, who goes off on these rambles, and we'll get to more in a moment. You also have this question of the divinity of Christ, and a lot of this originates from this painting by Hans, I believe it's pronounced Hans Holbein. I'm probably way out of my out of my league here trying to pronounce that, but a painting that struck Dostoevsky when he was on a trip with his wife. And in this painting, you have Christ in a very grotesque, distraught-looking manner. It's after his body is in the tomb, and he's obviously been crucified, and he looks very... I was going to try and come up with some word, but I think the best word for it is human. Christ looks very human in this painting. He looks weak and broken down and full of suffering and pain, and his body has just been shattered. And this is very different from the idea that we have of him resurrecting and being full of vitality and strength and of divinity. So this painting in real life struck Dostoevsky and made him very disturbed looking at it. He looked at it for a very long period, according to his wife. And he actually intertwines this painting into the novel itself. I believe it's first introduced in part 2, where the character Rogozhin has this painting on his wall. And it just like Dostoevsky, the painting really struck Prince Myshkin at this time. And he became very fixated on it, and again disturbed in his soul by just looking at it. Like something was wrong. He was basically faced with the reality of the world, the ugliness and the corruption and the pain and agony of existence. Yet the challenge of the prince was to remain faithful, to still stare at the face of this ugly reality, yet remain optimistic and idealistic rather than fall into nihilism. It's also worth mentioning that beyond this painting, the novel is full of references to biblical events, the Gospels, Christ himself. Either you'll get direct quotes and references, or you'll have allusions or certain characters or things they say will represent, something from the Bible. And that leads me to the main dichotomy that I see within the novel, which is idealism versus nihilism. And not idealism in the sense of Kant or Hegel, where we're looking at it from a metaphysical standpoint, but more so a society or cultural standpoint, where how do we look at the perceived meaninglessness of the world, the chaos, pain, suffering that we witness, and not fall into nihilism, but remain faithful and optimistic? Essentially, it's a belief that it's having faith and belief in mankind, that there is a good in humankind. There is an actual virtue of goodness, and there is a truth, and there is again, a love and passion that can bring us out of this state of moral decay and hatred and evil in the world. And this is what Prince Myshkin and also in the Brothers Karamazov Alyosha represent. And sometimes it's a little bit hard to pick up on this because Dostoevsky, he is a man of faith, and so you perceive it very much through a religious lens, and he is pushing or suggesting a Christian-like faith through these characters. But even beyond that, it is this idealistic view, again, of the world, this optimism that despite all the horror I'm seeing around me in reality and how brutal mankind and nature can be, I still have faith. I still hold my virtues, and I still have my ideals as my main pursuit, as my main purpose and meaning in life, is at least how I'm kind of perceiving it. So you have this dichotomy going on between Prince Myshkin and the characters that represent this nihilistic attitude would be Rogozhin and also Ippolit. Another main topic within the novel is the nature of love and marriage. And you almost have a little bit of this Pride and Prejudice thing going on where you have different love or relationships or these different affairs going on, and they have different reasonings or rationales for them. Similar to in Pride and Prejudice, where you have a marriage for status or wealth, utility, and then you have the true passionate love. You have a little bit of that going on here between the different love triangles and characters and manifestations of relationships that start to form throughout. But what stuck out to me very much, and I'll expand a little bit later on, is the nature of love. What does it mean to love purely? What does an unadulterated, unconditional love look like? Is it achievable? Can we separate love from, our irrational passions, or is it intertwined into that? Are they woven together? We'll expand on that later. But the last thing is Ippolit. We see him push in his kind of character and his different rambles and monologues a lot of these existentialist themes, especially ones centered around the pursuit of the journey and this idea that the journey, not the goal or the telos, is the meaning in life. That it was Columbus's pursuit of America, not the actual, boots on the ground discovering of America that gave him fulfillment. So again, it's that idea of it's more about the journey rather than the destination kind of idea that is rooted in existentialism, right? Not that there is a meaning in the world, but that we have to enjoy the kind of pursuit of the meaning, the becoming rather than the being, before I ramble too long on this point. Quote, "The point is in life alone, in discovering it, constantly and eternally, and not at all in the discovery itself." So now let's do a little bit more of a character breakdown on some of the main characters within the novel, starting with the prince. And I kind of already talked about how he's this radical optimist and very idealistic. He's got these seizures going on. He's this young man, and he's primarily in pursuit of Natasha Filipovna, but he's also got this other girl, Aglaya, as well. And how they describe him beyond just calling him an idiot for his naivety is they also refer to him as the poor knight. And what they're referencing is the specific poem that's mentioned in the novel. And the poor knight is this, just like the prince, idealistic knight who is in constant, servitude to his values and to his queen and to his ideals. And even if he can never attain it, he still remains resolute to it. And yet, he dies tragically, never obtaining his ideal. And so they refer to the prince as this poor knight who kind of just like a dog, constantly going after, this ideal, this virtue that he has, but never actually achieving it. So it kind of seems silly, right? It's, again, this conflict of idealism versus nihilism. But I think this quote paints it quite well. So on page 248, heading into 249, again, the translation I like is this one here from Vintage Classics. Quote, "This poem directly portrays a man capable of having an ideal, and second, once he has the ideal, of believing in it, and believing in it, of blindly devoting his whole life to it. That doesn't always happen in our time. In the poem, it's not said specifically what made up the ideal of the poor knight, but it's clear that it was some bright image, an image of pure beauty. So the knight isn't really disrespected in a way. He is this image of pure beauty. He just also happens to be this image of tragedy, a tragic knight, the poor knight. A little bit later on in the page, quote, "It was enough for him that he had chosen her and believed in her, quote, pure beauty, and only then did he bow down to her forever." So it's again this knight that Prince Myshkin's character really represents, who submits himself to the pursuit of this ideal, this pure beauty, this queen of his. And regardless of how frustrated and ridiculous as this woman Natasha gets, he's going to pursue her anyway, just like the poor knight did. Now, let's talk about this femme fatale, Natasha Filipovna. She is erratic, beautiful, capricious, absolutely crazy. She is the woman that men get on their knees and grovel for, knowing that she will ruin their life. And these men in the novel cannot help themselves. And I have a friend of mine that's reading the Brothers Karamazov right now, and I told him it's littered throughout Dostoevsky's books. It's full of these wild, erratic women that are just so seductive to these helpless men. You think of Grushenka in the Brothers Karamazov. You have a little bit of it in like Crime and Punishment as well. It's like these men just cannot help themselves but fall for the attractive allure of these femme fatales here. So Natasha, like I said, erratic, and if you haven't read the novel, I'm not being hyperbolic when I say she is capricious and ridiculous. Bouncing back and forth between Rogozhin and the prince is one thing. I get that. But she goes through like 3 different engagements with both of them. She's constantly about to get married to one of them, runs out the door at like the last minute. Then she's about to marry the other one and changes her mind, like leaves the state and go lives with the other man again. It's just this constant ping pong back and forth. And God, these helpless men just keep giving her a second, third, fourth chance. She's like the cat that's got 9 lives. You can't kill her until the end. But spoiler there. But she's a wild character, and yet I found myself seduced to her too. I was finding myself cheering for the prince to get her. Like finally at the end of the story, I was like, yes, he's finally got this, this girl worthy of saving, of redeeming. No, she was not. She was not worthy of it. Oh man, if you read the novel, you probably feel the same way I do about it at this point. But man, such an interesting character that you're able to be frustrated to no end about her, and yet you still, at least I did, I still like had this desire for her. But she's that character, and she also represents this hope for redemption. She had this very unfortunate upbringing, and she's kind of been pulled around by I believe his name is Totsky, basically this landowner who she's been living with, and she's kind of being like pressured basically to get married off. So you like feel for her somewhat until she does all this craziness. But I think that's enough on her. But she does represent this idea of redemption, I should say, of saving, in this balance between purity and innocence, but also self-loathing and irrational behavior. She's something else. And also towards the end of the story, you can see again this allusion kind of to Christ and these biblical and gospel elements as well. Quote, "But he sincerely believed that she could still rise." So you kind of have a little bit of that resurrection idea, this idea of redemption, right? That Christ really represented redemption for sinners, rising again, all of that. Next, we have Aglaya, who is the kind of gem of the other love triangle. So on one side, you have Prince Myshkin, Rogozhin, and Natasha, right? You got that love triangle. And then Prince is also part of another love triangle. He's a man in high demand, I guess. You have him, Gavrila, which we'll discuss in a moment, and Aglaya, who is the youngest daughter of the Apanshin family. And she is the youngest. She's the most beautiful. She's this radiant light of positivity and, again, idealism and passion. And hence her name, actually, Greek origin of it, stands for light and brilliance and radiance, I believe. So I like that that was kind of intertwined as well. And, again, she is caught up in the erratic behavior of both the prince and different characters within the novel. Gavrila wants to marry her, yet is doing what's going to do best for him socially and financially. We'll get to that in a moment. And so she kind of gets crushed there. She gets her idealistic vision for the world crushed there. And then you also have the prince, who kind of keeps leading her on, either through letters or discussions like, hey, I'm going to marry you. Her mom is like all over the place about whether the prince is going to marry her, whether she'll allow it, all this. And so you think, okay, she's going to end up with the prince. They're going to live happily ever after. It makes sense. It feels right. But as I discussed, the prince cannot help himself. He is so seduced by Natasha. And again, like just ends up crushing the hopes and dreams of Aglaya. So she's just one of these, key characters within the novel to also keep in mind. She also has this attitude and trait of rejecting societal norms, expectations of her family, especially towards the end of the novel. She just, after again being crushed by these two men, she just says the hell with it, and marries this Polish man, I believe, who is just a fraud, just a scoundrel, as they would say. But and that leads us to Ippolit, who is this young man who is fairly angry. He's resentful, and a lot of this is because he's dying of consumption. So throughout the novel, he represents the prototypical nihilist, and he's just expressing his frustration with the world. He harbors this, again, resentment. It feels like he's been given a bad lot in life, and there's this sense of unfairness going on and meaninglessness of his life. And he serves a couple purposes in the novel, but really how I see him and how Dostoevsky uses him is in an edifying manner. He uses them as a catalyst to generate certain behavior or reactions from characters. So, Ippolit will show up to the princes and drop a little bit of gossip or information, or, he'll rabble up Gavrila and get them all, frustrated and angry. And then he has this really important monologue in part 3 titled A Necessary Explanation. It's basically this suicide letter, is what it's supposed to be, that he has one copy and he has another copy he was going to send to Aglaya. And he carries on and on about a number of things, some of it related to purpose and a lot of existential themes, some of it related to God, some of it related to the certain situation they're in, his own experience, all of that. He references this brick wall, all these different things. So you just have to kind of read it. It's a little bit, I could almost spend a whole video on it. But overall, he's a complex and interesting character that you don't really even meet until the end of part 2, I think. You really meet him then. And he plays a pretty crucial and, like I said, an edifying role in part 3 and 4. Alright, now it's time for us to talk about Rogozhin. I've referenced him a couple times now in this video. And he is this atheist. He is a profligate. He has come upon a ton of wealth early in the novel, we find out. And he is just adamant about seizing whatever he desires. He lets his passions lead him. He is this, irrational madman, basically, throughout the novel. And you see it in his willingness to just continuously accept Natasha, and no matter how ridiculous she is and how seemingly unfaithful she is to him, he's always willing to just bring her in. And he admits, because like Natasha brings this up often, is that he loves me so much he'll probably kill me, and which very heavy foreshadowing, to leave it at that. But he admits it. At one point, he admits it to Prince, like, yeah, I probably will kill her, just because, he has this just unchecked passion and this radical personality, I would say. So that's what he represents. He's basically trying to buy off Natasha, and he's just chaotic character. The funny thing about him, though, is he kind of occurs quite sparsely throughout the novel. I mean, you get him, in the first chapter, right? And then you get him, fairly heavily in the second part, I believe, when he and the prince are at his apartment, or it's mom's house, whatever it is. But then he kind of just doesn't occur or appear that much throughout the novel. But when he does, it's very impactful. So that is Rogozhin. And then lastly, just a little note on Gavrila. He is this like young officer, I believe, who is trying to work up the social ladder, gain some wealth, and so he's willing to do what the head of the family, of the Panshin family, the general, wants him to do. He's supposed to marry Natasha, get the money from Tatsky through that marriage. That falls through, and he's this very frustrated character. He lacks self-confidence in his decision making. His convictions are very weak, and this leads him to basically get nothing. You weren't willing to play hard enough. You weren't willing to really stick your neck out and go for it. And so he kind of is this like indecisive character that just ends up empty-handed, is what I'd say. And he has these weird complex relationships too, where he's not really that angry or resentful at anybody. He even helps the prince in a lot of settings, and you'd think that because of what the prince does, like the end of the first part, you think he'd hate him, but he ends up just being a strange kind of character, I'd say. All right, now let's talk about book breakdown, and I'm not going to go too far into this because I feel like I'm already expanding further and making this video longer than it needs to be. But the first thing I want to talk about as far as elements and key ideas in the story is this question of humility, and again, the ideal, the ideal man, the virtue in the face of a decadent society. Like we can think about it today. Life can be viewed in such a cynical way, and I do it often too. You look at all the corruption in virtually every government, whatever country you're in, whatever state you might be in America, there's corruption everywhere. You turn on your TV or social media, you're being sold to by a salesperson. People have such moral ambiguity. They're willing to sell out their own family for financial gain. And it's so easy to look at that and just feel hopeless about mankind and humans. But a lot of what this novel represents is this resolute man, this poor knight in Prince Myshkin, that says the hell with it. I'm remaining strong in my faith, and I'm holding these ideals and these virtues as my North Star. That's what I'm in pursuit of. That's what's the most meaning to me. I'm willing to love it. And it kind of goes back to that quote about the poor knight. He was committed to this love of his forever. This idea of pure beauty. So that's something that stood out to me. I also really like this idea of redemption that you see in more than just Natasha's story, but overall this idea of again, a redeeming quality, and it ties to what I just spoke about, right? Like, is man capable of redemption? Can he turn it around? So you get that as well, and you kind of get it too with Ippolet's failed suicide attempt. He kind of has a chance to reevaluate. And also is a really important point that doesn't really get brought up later in the novel, is Prince Myshkin tells the story twice about how when he was in France, he witnessed a guillotine execution. And I think it was a guillotine execution. Well, he references that, but he also just references an execution in general. I think it was a firing squad situation where they backed out of it. And a lot of this is an allusion to Dostoevsky's own experience, where he had this kind of like fake execution day where he was supposed to get murdered and they called it off and all that, and he speaks about that a lot. But he in the story, the prince talks about how that man said that within those 5 minutes, those last 5 minutes he thought he had to live, he lived like a million lifetimes, and everything felt slow. And he said that if he had the chance to live, he would make every minute count. He would live differently. So again, pushing this idea of second chances and redemption. And lastly, just to harp on it a little bit more, what does it mean to love? I asked my wife this actually while I was reading the story. As painful as the relationship between the prince and Natasha goes on throughout the novel, he's constantly just getting emotionally crushed and you know, seeing her run off with another man, and yet he still remains faithful to her. He still loves her. And what is it to love like that? What is it to love somebody so passionately, so unconditionally, that no matter what, they could stick a dagger in you, you're still going to love them? Because it's I guess it's because it's not the physical them, it's not the material, it is this transcendent idea. You know, I mean, that's what an ideal is, or a faith is. It's an abstraction, right? So maybe that's what it is. But I really enjoyed entertaining cognitively, intellectually, that idea of what does it mean to love like that? What is that true, just unchecked, passionate love look like? Can that be achieved today? If it is, where is it? What does it look like? You know, that was just something that stood out to me. But overall, to wrap up this whole video and the discussion on the idiot, I loved it. I really loved it. I gave it 5 stars. I actually gave it a pretty lengthy review on Goodreads, and I plan to do a lot more consistent reviews on Goodreads. Not of books I don't like, but 4 and 5 star books, they'll probably get a good review. So if you're looking for that kind of stuff, if you care about my opinion, check out my Goodreads. I'll have it somewhere on the screen, and you can add me in the description as well. But with that said, love the novel. Like I said, it was very much a slow drip of enjoyment. It hit on a lot of enriching philosophical questions that I like to consider and entertain. I want to dive deeper and reread some of Dostoevsky's novels to get a firmer grasp on what is his philosophy, what is his outlook on life, like what is Dostoevsky's perspective of the ideal, you know, the idealist. What does it mean to be a Prince Myshkin and Alyosha, and even the redemptive quality of a Raskolnikov, right, in Crime and Punishment. What does that look like in society? But overall, Dostoevsky's the man. Fyodor's the man, and I love his works. I love Russian literature. It's so emotionally fulfilling. It is food for the soul, and I think all of you will love this book too. So highly recommend it. Please, please, please let me know what you thought about the book in the comments down below. Did you fall for Natasha the same way I did? Do you see yourself in Prince Myshkin? Do you have any of that kind of relatability to him? Anything that I missed that you think is worth noting in the comments below, quotes that stood out, let me know. That's a lot of what I want this series to be, is a back and forth of me hearing what you guys think, what I got wrong, what I maybe missed or interpreted differently. Let me know. So drop it in the comments, like the video if you enjoyed it, share it with a friend, subscribe for more content like this, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.